You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. My name is Jay Reckward. My co-host is Jake Reckward, my dad. We are hosting a podcast where we examine Star Trek Next Generation episode by episode, season by season, to explore its theme, contents, and characters. We're doing this for the benefit of my son and Jake's grandson, Ben, but we know so many great Star Trek fans are out there, so we're putting the show up for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm okay, Jay, and you?
I'm doing good. I'm actually really excited to talk about this episode. We are reviewing Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 2, Where Silence Has Lease, which debuted November 28th, 1988. Last episode, when we looked at The Child, I thought that it was one of the weaker episodes to open the season with. I think that in comparison, this, and in somewhat contrast, this is a very good episode, even though it has kind of a wonky beginning. But once you get past kind of the wonky beginning, it's an excellently plotted and paced episode that features a lot of good interaction between the characters and some very good tension. What did you think of the episode?
I thought it had some really good twists to it because, first, one of the things we've talked about before is how the music can play such a good role. And it made me just think about how creative the composers have to be to write musical scores to accompany, television and movies. I mean, it's really amazing what they have to do, the timing and coming up with the right move. The program music is one of the terms that is used. And then I think when you say that the beginning's kind of wonky with, the concern that Picard expresses to Troy about, well, what are Worf and Riker doing? And Riker has joined Worf on the holodeck to have one of his combat, scenarios, and it gets very deep, and Worf gets really into it, and I think it shows it's something where they're bonding the two characters together. It shows Worf what happens to a Klingon when they go in total combat mode, and it actually kind of sets up Riker and Worf transporting over to the faux Yamato once they're in this void, and what they have to do together.
So let's examine the scene opening up the show. Bringing the folks listening up to speed, the USS Enterprise D is on a charting mission in the Morgana Quadrant. I actually found that the setup for this episode interesting in the fact that this is the first manned exploration of this quadrant, which means that they had sent either probes or some sort of unmanned research vessel or craft beforehand, which kind of gets into what maybe the future of space exploration is going to be. But back to the holodeck, we open up on this bridge. We open up on the bridge with with Picard walking out of his ready room, and there's this real nervous tension on the bridge because everyone knows that Worf and Riker are down in the holodeck in Worf's calisthenics program, which is basically, Thunderdome.
Yes, right.
I kept watching this, and the reason I said it was so wonky is because why are they doing this? Like, I understand the bonding, and I agree with that. I think it sets up a good relationship between Riker and Worf in a way. But it, if there's an inherent sense of danger in doing this with Worf, why is Picard risking this when he knows that there is real consequences if something goes wrong? It seems like a very weird situation the entire crew has put themselves in, where they know that their chief security is is practiced in violent martial arts and combat, but now they're risking their first officer to join him in that. It just doesn't make sense to me. There's no real setup for this. You know, I find the moment where Riker kind of has to bark Worf down for a moment or try to get him under control interesting as well, because there's an episode later on in this season where Riker takes part in a cultural exchange between the crew of the Enterprise and the crew of a Klingon vessel, where he serves as their first officer for the time
Right,
being.
right, yes.
Um, there is this kind of sense of rigid discipline in the Klingon warrior code, and it seems odd to me that Worf, who is so studied and disciplined himself in his own kind of orphan culture, is almost willing to lose it and come close to attacking his superior officer. It's
Hmm.
just a very weird scene.
It is. It
I
is.
don't
Yeah,
understand the utility of it
yeah.
besides a weird sense of bonding, but you could have done that other ways too.
It could have, because once that's over, it moves into the main story quickly.
Also, just not a very good fight scene.
No,
Like,
no.
out of all the shows on TV, I have to say, Star Trek: The Next Generation has some of the worst fight scenes, especially in these early seasons. They're really bad.
Hmm.
And the the fight between Worf and the skull creature with the axe had so many logical inconsistencies. At one point, Worf disarms the skull creature, and he has two weapons now, but he throws one of them away. And I'm like, wait a second, don't you want to use that? You're going to pick it up later and try to cut Riker's head off. You need it. It
Right.
just nonsensical. Um,
Yes.
but so we transition from this nonsensical scene to basically the main bulk of the story for Where Silence Has Lease, where they're on the bridge and there is this encounter where they have found this kind of unknown void in space that has no mass or no energy. Um, Data records it as a Data is basically asked multiple times, what is it? And he basically has to boil down for Picard and Riker. I literally have no means to really measure or answer your questions for you. I have no idea what this is in front of us, kind of highlighting the severity of the challenge they're about to face. This is truly not only a first contact, but this is an encounter in interstellar space that has real danger to it from the get go.
And one of the thing Worf adds, just the Klingon,
Right.
he sees it as a threat right away, and then tells that there's based on an old Klingon legend, that there's something like this that is, where Klingon ships have been lost. And the other comment that I made is that whether having a discussion is, well, what is this? Since it has no mass, no energy, they describe it as a void. And at one point, Data says, could a lack of dimension be another dimension in itself? Which is
Yes.
very much a circular argument. And it's like, you think about that, how do you even discuss that idea?
I I think it gets later on into the you made a note later on about Planck measurements in terms of, when they use the stationary beacon to measure their actual physical distance as they travel away from it in the void.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of physical rules are being broken in our universe. A lot of things, that are happening within the Negilum creature, which getting to what this is revealed to be. Um, all the rules of Euclidean physics seem to break down inside of this void. It is almost as if it is a universe within it. It is a roaming sentient universe um, within itself that has its own sense of time and space, and also its own sense of manifestation. Like Negilum can create physical objects that the crew can actually travel to, like the cloned the constructed USS Yamato. At the same time, Negilum can also kill people, as he does with I forget the character's name. Uh, let me.
Haskell. Haskell is
Yeah,
the crewman's name. Yeah.
that character actually appeared previously in Skin of Evil. He was the shuttle pilot for Troy.
Oh, interesting.
So he's dead now. So that's what happened to that character. But
Well, coming back to the
Nagilum has a lot of things that he can do within his own space in terms of manipulation of actual physical space time as it occurs on the bridge of the Enterprise, because it seems like regular physics is still present on the bridge and within the ship itself,
well,
but outside of it, it's not.
just for the listeners, what happens is that when the Enterprise is in this void,
Well, they're
strange things,
swallowed by it.
you're swallowed by it, and a number of things happen. I guess first is the beacon is launched, and they move away from it, and they're measuring
Hmm.
on their chronometer that you know their velocity at whatever warp they were, and they're moving away from the beacon, but then they come back to it. And when we talk about the Planck measurements, I looked this up because I'd heard about this before. There is some scientific controversy as to whether the universe is linear, spherical, and whether it actually folds back in on itself, whether it is
Yes.
circular or not. We don't need to get into a heavy discussion of that. But then,
Well, without getting into a heavy discussion, there's one thing that we do know, that the construction of the universe, we don't know if it's circular or. We do know, however, that it is to a certain extent, flat,
mm,
and that
mhm,
there. Now, when we say flat, we don't mean like flat in terms of a 2D space, like a sheet of
right,
paper
right,
on a table. We mean flat as, imagine a sponge sitting on a table.
hmm
Our
hmm
galaxy is somewhere inside of that sponge.
right.
So the
And
universe looks like a big sponge, but everything inside of it is us and
and then
everyone
right,
else.
and then you mentioned Negilum, who is the entity that seems to be
Right.
the life form in this system, in this void. And after the beacon, I think that's when the crew gets tested, where a what is it, a Klingon battle cruiser shows up and attacks
Romulan
them.
battle cruiser shows
Romulan
up.
battle cruiser, and it just goes away. And then the Yamato shows up, their sister ship, and they can't contact anyone. So then Worf and Riker beam over, and
Right.
they figure it out because of the material it's made from, that it's not a real ship, and they have again the circularity comes in where they get to the bridge, and they go through one of the turbo lifts, and they come back on the same bridge and so forth, and they finally come back to the Enterprise. And I think it's that point that, and it might be that they have these little openings where they can see space and they try to escape to it. Oh, yeah, they're tempted to escape, but Riker and Worf are still on the faux Yamato, and Picard doesn't leave them behind. He wants to get them off the Yamato before he gets through. And then once they don't get through, they realize that they're being further tested by these open areas of space where they could possibly escape, keep moving around, and they can never get to it. That's when Negilum, this entity, finally reveals itself.
So, so sorry to interrupt.
And then it becomes apparent. I think it was Dr. Pulaski says that, this seems like an experiment, like we're rats in a cage.
Right, rats in a maze.
Yeah, right.
So it seems that Negilum is almost at least within his own realm, or at least within whatever his physical space is. We can't really define him as having a body, because as Data says, he has neither mass or dimension.
Energy.
Or energy. Which brings up some very disturbing notions of life and how that's defined. Because by all definitions, Negilum is a life form, so therefore he has life, he has sentience and consciousness. But if he doesn't have any energy, like, how does he fit the other criteria for life?
So from some of the other atypical life forms that we've encountered in the series, this is really the most bizarre yet.
Correct. Well, it brings up a lot of questions about some of the other forms that we've run into, like Q, for example. Q has, as we've discussed previously, a certain level of omnipotence, omniscience, but not omnipresence. Nagilum doesn't have omnipresence either, but within his realm, he has obvious omniscience and he has obvious omnipotence. With these things, we're looking at a universe that's full of life forms and creatures that have powers that go far outside the bounds of any technology we can really create. If we measure how Picard really gets out of this, he bluffs his way out of situation and saves the crew by basically daring Nagilum to kill them, showing them that, like, we as humans are not afraid of your kind of tyrannical experiment. But at the same time, there's this sense that once the experiment's over, Nagilum is going to kind of disappear from this universe. And I say that because at the very beginning of the episode, when Data is first measuring Nagilum's appearance in space, they notice that, like, it appears and disappears off sensors. I think Negilum is a transdimensional being that's able to move through dimensions. So while he may not have mass or dimension or energy in this universe, he might be part of an alternate universe where he does. And maybe when the Enterprise enters him, I think Negilum might be inside an intertertiary space, someplace in between. But it's really hard to tell, because once the creature's revealed, I think you see this certain. There isn't a machine aspect to him. Like, he isn't measuring. He isn't taking data on certain things that, I think if he were like a general AI or an artificial general intelligence, I don't think he would be asking questions about, like, how things die, how things live, how do you procreate. He probably would have already come across that and figured that out over time. I think what we see here with Negilum is this real sense of cruelty that is, you know, I he has this conversation with Picard where, we don't share many things, and Picard says, well, we share one thing in common. And I always thought, even when I'm watching this episode for probably the 40th time in my life, I always thought that Picard was going to say cruelty. Because if you look at what Negilum does in this experiment, he has this very cruel disregard for his subjects or the lab rats.
Well, it's the couple things. First of it, what you said, yes, with the analogy that the Enterprise are like rats in a maze, it's what a superior species is doing to an inferior one. It
Yes.
has that attitude. The other thing you said about the intertertiary dimension, that goes back to last season when we had, we'll always have Paris. And
Yes.
the, what's his doc professor, whatever his name
Oh,
was,
right.
Paul,
Yeah.
whatever, that he created that funny,
Mannheim.
time
The
thing.
Mannheim effect.
Mannheim. Yeah, Paul Mannheim. And he at one point felt like he was betwixt two universes. That could be described, that concept in that episode was kind of a intertertiary thing between two different universes. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that what you say about Negilum is that that entity, he, she, whatever, uh, really didn't understand the concept of death, but understood that the human body was not permanent, that it did die. So he's very interested in exploring that. And I think after Picard had decided that he was not going to kowtow to Negilum and he was going to destroy the Enterprise, and they decided, well, we'll give 20 minutes to allow the crew to prepare for their end and so forth. And Data comes in and talks to Picard about, well, what is death?
A
You know,
very subtle but compelling scene.
and my question is, since Data and then Troy, come in and say, you're doing this wrong, this is the wrong thing, and so forth, you shouldn't be doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when Data had the conversation with Picard about how he felt about death, was Data actually, channeling Negilum so that Negilum could hear what Picard said, and it was part of the all testing to try to understand what was going on and what these humans thought. So
Oh.
did Negilum, start to realize, well, maybe these beings are a little bit more sophisticated than I'm giving them credit for in terms of their thinking about themselves and so on.
Well, I think the answer to that is that I think they were, and this gets back to my comments about kind of the physical nature of Negilum. Negilum basically created holograms to dupe
Right.
Picard. The first one
Yes.
being Troy, and then the next one being Data. Um, I have a theory because of Worf's first comments upon seeing the creature. Um, he relates this Klingon legend of this creature in space that swallows ships whole, which makes me think like, okay, they've run into Negilum before. At least Negilum's been in the Alpha Quadrant before, or something like Negilum. If that's the case, I think Negilum actually knows that. I think once he kills Haskell, he doesn't actually have to follow through on the rest of the experiment. I think, honestly, it's all a show of cruelty.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's almost like, to use an extreme example, like Mengele.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sure, Mengele had his curiosities, probably, in his experiments, but a lot of it was just base torture.
Absolutely. Yes.
And at some point, it just seems like Nagilum is just, it's, the experiment goes, if the experiment is rats in the maze, then the person running the maze is the cobra. because the moment Negilum is found out and the experiment's over, the cover's blown, the control is taken away. The control being no one knowing that he's there. He literally becomes like this predator that's just kind of playing with his food right before he ends them. Like, here's this chance to escape, here's this chance to escape. Hey, take this chance to escape and leave behind your friends doing it, but here's a chance to escape. Even to the point where, like, Picard understands this creature's cruelty, that he has to wait to the very last second to know that this creature is not tricking him, and he's willing to die at the very last second just to know, because he recognizes the danger of what he's facing.
He does. I agree with that. Yeah.
And I think that danger is kind of an, one of the things that I think it places this definitely in the realm of science fiction, and some of it is the character of Picard himself. Like, kind of an extraordinary bravery in the face of the things that he goes against. Because, Q on one hand is terrifying enough. Q literally, like, can transport members of his crew off of his ship into hellscapes. He's literally staring down a creature that can swallow his entire ship whole and didn't have to let him go. This creature could have just devoured the Enterprise. In many ways, this story is about human bravery and the endurance to see things through, even at the greatest amount of risk, versus the peculiar and often cold nature of the universe. Like, in many ways, I think Negilum is the universe personified. We had many conversations last season about the unique risks that Picard and the crew take on when they take the Enterprise D out into the universe. It's not only a warship, it's a research vessel, but it's not only a research vessel, as we've noted in multiple episodes where they've had to deal with pandemics or epidemics or tragedies on other planets where they've had to provide rescue. It's also a medical vessel, but at the same time, it's also kind of like this floating city that has all these families and civilians on it. And they all just got swallowed by this entity, and he's giving 1,000 people 20 minutes to say goodbye.
Yes.
There's just a level of holy shit that I don't think is humanly possible to qualify, but yet here's this bald Frenchman just staring down the universe. In many ways, I think it speaks well to the nature of humans, which Picard is meant to represent, the good parts of us. But on the other hand, there's a certain amount of, I think we have to recognize in this episode, like, there's a huge risk being taken that has no guarantee of working out. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on that?
No, I thought it was a pretty, extreme decision that Picard made, but I think that as it says at the end, when there's literally seconds left, and he and Riker cancel the auto destruct, and I think it was Wesley Crusher says, "Well, why did he wait so long on his bluff?" And Riker says, "Do you think he was really bluffing?" And it was a very extreme decision that Picard made, and I think at the same time that there, since these avatars, these holograms that Nagila created to talk to Picard, say to him, "This is the wrong thing you're doing," and so forth. It was another test, and Picard realized that, hey, this is not what Data and Troy would not really behave this way. So he knew it was another test, and that's why he had to hold on so long.
It was a great piece of dialogue too. Like
Hmm.
just the subtle things like Troy and Data both calling him Jean-Luc when they never call him that.
Yes. Right.
Um,
Right.
Even Data walking into the scene, um, acting very differently, almost childlike and
Hmm.
precocious.
Hmm.
Like, what happens when you die? Well, it's like Data is an android. He could literally look at the Enterprise database and look at 1,000 different theories about what happens when you die.
Right. Philosophies,
Um,
religions, and so on.
I think one thing that might I'm interested in I'm interested in what you think Picard's view of death in the universe is, and if I may, I actually have the quote here of what he believes death to be. Uh,
Go ahead.
Here, I'll actually read the entire
Go ahead. Yeah.
section of the scene. I have a question, sir. Yes, Data. What is it? What is death? Oh, is that all? Oh, is that all? Oh, Data, you're asking probably the most difficult of all questions. Some see it as a changing into an indestructible form, forever unchanging. They believe that the purpose of the entire universe is to maintain that form in an earth-like garden which will give delight and pleasure through all eternity. On the other hand, there are those who hold to the idea that are blinking into nothingness, that all of our experience and that all of our experiences and hopes and dreams merely a delusion. What do you believe, sir? Considering the marvels, sorry, folks. Let me take a sip real quick. There we go. Considering the marvelous complexity of the universe, its clockwork perfection, its balances of this against that, matter, energy, gravitation, time, dimension, I believe that our existence must be more than either of these philosophies. That what we are goes beyond Euclidean or other practical measuring systems, and that our existence is part of a reality beyond which we understand now as reality. That's a lot, but I think in some ways it's interesting because Picard has this view of death and, in many ways, a worldview of the universe that is open to creatures like Negilum and open to creatures like Q. But I find it interesting because, in many ways, especially with the line, um, considering the marvelous complexity of the universe, its clockwork perfections, its balances of this against that, it seems to me like there are a bunch of creatures in the universe that he's running into now that kind of defeat the notion of the balances of this against that.
Listening to you read what Picard's comments were to Data, I just think it reflects, um,
He's
a
clearly
broad.
a humanist and a spiritualist.
Yes, and I think that when you get to, whatever one thinks about death, from a religious or just a purely spiritual perspective, it's totally non-empirical. It's totally non-scientific. I
Yes.
mean, death in some way is the greatest adventure that any human has.
Well, it's interesting how Picard doesn't fall between this notion of going to kind of a heaven or blinking out into nothingness, which really does seem in some ways to be the Eastern view of our metaphysical universe versus the Western view.
Hmm.
But his view, in many ways, is kind of a it's kind of like Carl Sagan. I think if Carl Sagan had turned into a religion, like it's scientism taken to a spiritual dimension, to where there's the key question I think is I don't know. And in having this kind of faith in the idea of I don't know, Picard is hoping and somewhat hoping and understanding that there will be a greater adventure beyond this, even though he knows that he has no proof of that.
Exactly. Right.
But I think with creatures like Negilum, um, it's a very interesting moment to hold what Picard sees as his faith and his view of the universe against this creature he's contending with. Because, like we've covered, this creature really does break all the rules of the universe. And it's easy to say, I'm going to look into the abyss and never turn into the monster or not have the abyss look back into me, which is from Nietzsche. But the episode's a really interesting contrast between Picard having kind of this blind faith in what we're talking about versus the reality I think that this monster is. Because to me, the reason I like this episode, this monster as a villain is truly terrifying. Truly, utterly terrifying. There's nothing they can do to beat him.
No.
Absolutely nothing at all. And in many ways, it's good when Negilum says you'll never see me again, even though Picard thinks, we'll run into you again.
Do you think that the way that the communication between Negilum and Picard ended and how Picard handled it, that Negilum, after he killed Haskell and he ran his test on the rats in the maze, that Negilum ended up having a little bit more, not respect, but maybe appreciation for humanity than he did before the encounter started. Because in some ways, he could have just destroyed them, but he did let them off.
I think
Of course,
that.
this would have to happen as part of the story, or there wouldn't be episode 3.
Yeah, of course. Um, and reflecting on the fact that the writers do have to write the character in a way where there is an episode 3.
Yes, exactly.
I think one of two things happened. I think either Nagilum got bored with his toys and decided, I'm just moving on, where, Q's an infant. Q never gets bored with his toys.
Mm-hmm.
Or, I think, I truly believe that even though things in this universe may come in different forms and have different senses of perception, I think there will still be certain things universal to all of us. And one of those will be fear. And I'm not saying that Nagilum necessarily fears Picard or necessarily fears humans, but there's something about us that we're willing to go to the very edge of the razor to win. Um, Even if that win seems like the most self-destructive thing we can do. That if I'm the enemy and I'm an alien and I have to face humans, there's a part of me at some point that looks across the battlefield and just goes fuck, these people are crazy. It's kind of like Ben, I'm going to throw back here and you won't know what I'm talking about. I'll hopefully explain it to you along the way. Uh one thing that I think happened in after 9/11 or September 11th, 2001, when the two towers were brought down by two hijacked aircraft, I think that we as a world and a nation didn't recognize the true threat of terrorism because it made us flinch in a real way that it had never done before by bringing down those two buildings. And I think that the reason why we don't have a serious plan or serious tactics or a real way to end terrorism is because it's a little bit like Picard and the crew going to the edge of the razor to beat Negilum. You have to. They set the self destruct for 20 minutes. 20 minutes for 1,011 people to say goodbye to each other. And,
Mm-hmm.
they're trapped in this void. They're never going to be no one's ever going to find them. All these children are about to die. They can't communicate with anyone outside, so no one's going to know. I'm repeating now, but the I bet you Negilum at some point just looked at Picard and he's like, I really don't want to keep messing with this. Like, I might win, but it's not going to be fun for me.
Hmm.
I think that he lost interest in his toys, but at the same time, I think he looked at his toy and realized that I'm running around with scissors,
Hmm.
and while it might be fun in the meantime, and I can put down the scissors whenever I want,
Right.
these scissors might cut me. I think
Yeah.
that's what happened.
Yeah.
But that's only my conjecture. Um, one thing that is interesting is that there is a progression between the relationship between Picard and Riker, especially when they have that joke about the flat Earth.
Yes.
Um, this season, there's very much more of a equal camaraderie to them, it seems,
Yes.
and like a real
Yes.
friendship too,
Yeah, we talked about that, where that was a change in the writing and is reflected in the first episode of this new season. And
and the
that's
beard.
where, yeah, the beard, and where the joking came up again about the flat earth, Yes.
Well, I
Mhm.
think it is an interesting change from the first season where Beardless Riker was very much differential to the captain, but he was also overprotective of Picard, where he doesn't seem to have that overprotectiveness this season.
Right. Correct.
Part of it seemed like I thought the first season there was a real intention by the writers to separate the experience levels between Picard and Riker as captain and commander, and somewhat place them at different points in terms of age and experience. But at this point in season two, it seems like we're looking at two people who are very much partners in what they do and friends, and also have similar experiences in many ways. Like Will Picard almost already looks at Will as a captain.
Hmm.
In many ways, his co-captain. He's not just a subordinate. He's someone that he can actually trust to go and run the ship in his
Right.
place.
Right.
But I think the relationship being more casual is very apparent here. What do you think of like the nature of the relationship being more casual here than what it was in the first
Well,
season? Do you like that or
yeah, I like that because I think that this may have happened a little bit in the first season, but maybe it'll be more frequent here where they're both on the bridge and they're dealing with a threatening situation. And uh, Picard will take a stance on one thing, but then Riker will say, you know, change course, go to impulse, go to, yellow alert and so forth. Because, and when he makes, Picard doesn't tell him to do that, but they're working, they seem like they're working together of one mind so that Riker knows what he should do as the executive officer, as the
yeah.
first officer, to complement what Picard's doing and kind of let Picard think more strategically so that Riker's doing, is in sync with that strategic thinking, but he's doing more of the tactical stuff. And then
Well,
sometimes Picard will become tactical also.
yeah. Well, there's an interesting sharing of authority here where
Exactly. Exactly.
well, it's very pronounced when they're discussing about how to deal with um, getting out of the void
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
the initial engagement once they're swallowed.
Hmm. Yes.
Um, at one point, like decides to support Worf's theory and
Mhm.
ideas about how to deal with things over Data or Picard's, and there's actually a little bit of disagreement between them about it. And Picard chooses his solution, and Riker's still fine with it. It's
Yeah.
it's very much a team atmosphere,
Hmm.
but there's still that delineation of a hierarchy, but the
Right.
hierarchy is very fluid, and it's
Right.
almost like there isn't it's not here's Picard at 1 and Riker at 2. it's very much this season. Picard is 1, and then Riker's very much 1A.
Hmm.
And then, Data being second in command, he's very much 3, he's very much B, and then it goes down from
Hmm.
there. I think that is obviously for writing purposes, a more fruitful relationship. You can
Yes.
have more emotional encounters from it.
Yes, sure.
Um,
Absolutely.
you know, Dr. Pulaski is going at Data again, and
Yes. Right.
I floated this idea last episode that we discussed about possibly in the future where there are androids in widespread AI, that there might be a movement of people who are anti AI, not future Luddites, but like just anti AI in general and anti Android. And we've seen, and like I mentioned last time, we saw that in Picard, and that played a huge theme in the Picard series. But it seems very much here that Pulaski is very much just
She she
disregarding Data's dignity as a living thing.
she just cannot grasp the concept of an android being as functional as Data is.
Well, there at one point she kind of admits that like she really doesn't want to, but because Starfleet has deemed him to be alive,
Right.
she has to respect him as a living being
Yes.
to the
Right.
point where like when she turns to Picard and says, "Can you make it do this thing that I want it to do?"
Right.
Picard has to use like Data's proper masculine pronouns
Right.
to like identify like, "Hey, this is a dignified member of this crew. You don't just talk to him like he's, the convenience machine down the hall."
Right.
Um, I this is like another moment where I just kind of build a general dislike for
Yes.
Pulaski.
Right. I,
And
I knew you were
you
going to
know,
say that.
well, second episode in, what do you think of her now that we've had a second iteration of her interacting with the general crew?
I don't dislike her. I think she's, as a
Mm-hmm.
physician, she's competent. We'll have to see. I can't remember it'll have to see as the season goes on whether she resolves for herself, her attitude toward data, and whether she appreciates him and respects him, or whether she
Right.
still has problems with him.
There's also I've always felt like there's this tension between Picard and Pulaski where they kind of don't like each other, and the show kind of sets it up where they're always separate from each other in a way.
Mhm.
And when they do come together, it's always there's always this tension about it.
Well, maybe the writers did it, and it could be just that they're making a counterpoint where Picard and Beverly Crusher had a relationship because from their past, and we know that they have certain feelings for one another. And Beverly's not on the Enterprise anymore, so Dr. Pulaski comes on board, and it's obvious that her personality is much harder than what Dr.
Hmm.
Crusher's is.
Well, I also think that it's good to have those counterpoints,
Yes.
but I think you have to build them in an effective way to where when they counter the main character or they counter the captain,
Hmm.
they do so in a way that's actually contributing to the overall narrative.
Right.
I feel like in many ways I think Pulaski's wasted because the only thing you really remember from her here is that she's really mean to Data.
Hmm.
Other than that, like she's kind of a I don't think it's the actress that's at fault here, but I don't think the writers are doing her any favors, even in the second episode.
I can see that. Sure.
Um, so let's see. I actually think that's everything. I think that we've
I
covered the
think that
show for this
covers it.
evening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so before we go one last time, what do you think of the show? where do you think this episode falls so far in the season, and in general, the Next Generation? Where do you place it? Do you think it's good? Do you think it's bad?
I
Weak?
would say
Strong?
I say it would be
Have at it.
I say it would be in the middle. Um, of all the stories and so forth. We talked about how it has this sort of kind of you know questionable opening scene and so forth. But then it really just kind of gets into one main story of dealing with
Mm-hmm.
this unknown void and so forth. And actually, what happens flows pretty well from there as they get
Well,
more
very
involved,
well. Yes,
right? And they get very involved with it. They understand what's happening. Negilum reveals himself. Picard decides how to deal with Negilum and so forth. And thankfully, it has a good outcome for the Enterprise.
it's it's a very good narrative with very good tension throughout.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you
Yes.
in terms of episodes. I think it does fall in the middle. Um, I think that this would actually have been a better season premiere than The Child. I think if this had been the first episode and The Child came after this one, I think The Child would have actually been received a little bit better. Um, just because this is a much stronger episode than the premiere.
Yeah, it is. I think that could have worked. Yes,
Yeah,
that could have worked. Yeah.
but overall, I think it's a really good episode. I really am terrified in the Galen character, so therefore I really kind of like the new Galen character. I'm glad we never see him again in the show because, you know, unlike Q, where there's this playfulness and this sense of limitation, I think that this character would have been hard to write around in a
Yeah.
second encounter.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So, with that, we will close up for tonight, everyone. We will see you next time for Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 3, a favorite of everyone's, Elementary, Dear Data.
Oh, yes.
And we'll see you all next time. Thanks, Dad.
Thanks, Jay. Good night.
Good night.